welcome. So this is our next installment of Mesa Prieta's Chat with the Archaeologist. Thank you for tuning in. This month we'll be talking about migration and why migration is never actually a simple story. Human migration is a complex topic, and we'll be getting into some of the reasons why that's complicated and what are some of the implications. Before we get moving though, I do want to make a couple of announcements, really just one. Today's lecture is our last regularly scheduled Chat with the Archaeologist. These were initially scheduled to run through November. Within Mesa Prieta, we've talked it over, and we'll be continuing this series at least into the spring. So, this is, again, something that's been new to us this year. There have obviously been some hiccups, but it seems that there's been a lot of interest, and we've been getting a lot of engagement, and it sounds like folks have been learning a lot about archaeology and archaeology topics. So, yeah, since you folks have been enjoying this and getting something out of it, it seems worthwhile to continue going. So, right before we move on, I just want to check the stream health here. Okay. So we'll begin with a little bit of story time. And this is a story from Tessie Naranjo, who is Tewa from Santa Clara Pueblo. As excuse me, I lost my page here. But we can come back to this one. Oh, here we go. So, Tessie tells the story of her ancestors. We were coming from the direction of Santa Fe. Some were stopped. First they were going by Ogapiokinge. There they buried a kaje, sacred objects, that will bring soft rain. From there they traveled to Tetsuge, or the cottonwood tree place. Some were left there at the cottonwood tree place. From there on they traveled to Nambe. They traveled again and stopped near Posouige, or the drinking water place. And from there they went on to Po'owige. From there they came to Owene singing. Then the leaders went to Tsikumu. There a kaje was planted. And so, if a cloud appears, a very heavy rainstorm will come and make mean clouds. It's because the kaje are angry. From there, some of the people went to Okeowinge, and then from there others continued on to Picaris and Taos. Taos is called Piinsu because the mountains are tall in the area. They went to Blue Lake, and that became the place where the most Pinum, great power, because that's where the kaje, which have the most Pinum, were left. Now the story is very different from the ones that you may have heard on some of Mesa Prieta's talks this year on the origins of the Tewa and their arrival here along the northern Rio Grande. It contrasts very starkly with the one recorded by renowned anthropologists that detailed migration down from the Four Corners area, and we'll touch on those too. Specifically, the most well-known story is that related by Alfonso Ortiz, and that's going to be one of the ones we get into in a later slide. But the point that I'm making is that people move, They move great distances, and it's actually not as simple as everyone just packing up and heading out together in one smooth wave. So, today's talk is about answering some questions. Why are we interested in migration? What lines of evidence do we use? What are the complicating factors? And what are the impacts of this research? Excuse me for just a second here. So, why are we interested in migration? Well, of course, this is one of the big picture questions that we can ask in archaeology. And that's, where do people come from? Who that's there today is descended from people of the past, or where are their ancestors from? As American citizens, many of us have migration stories. How did our families get here, right? Including the sort of mythical origins of our country with the arrival of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock in 1620. That is often seen as a watershed event and in the formation of American identity. That too, of course, is a migration. Now, of course, there's these oral traditions are an important line of evidence, whether it's the story of the Mayflower, or whether it's Tessie Naranjo's story, or whether it's the version of the Tewa migration as related by Alfonso Ortiz. Oral traditions are an important line of evidence, but there are also complicating factors too. Before we get into the complicating factors, I'm getting ahead of myself. We also, as archaeologists, look at the material evidence, of course. We look at the things that are in the ground. We date carbon samples. We date artifacts based on their style. We really put the stories that we've heard to the test. And the complicating factors are, one, the resolution of these tests. You know, if we're using carbon dates as a line of evidence, they're not 100%, they're not always 100% accurate. You get error bars, and depending on the quality of the sample and where it comes from, those error bars can be wider or they can be narrower. And what I mean by error bars is we don't just get a date. If we were to, find some charcoal at Plymouth and date it, we wouldn't just get a point that says December 1620. We would get a range that would be usually about like 1580 to 1660, right? And that's so we can say confidently that it's within that range. Maybe it's a lower quality sample, and instead it looks like 1550 to 1700. Well, that's a pretty wide range, and it could be anywhere in there. It's not necessarily in the middle. Some of the other things that we use to date an archaeological site, to try to put the pieces of the puzzle together, are artifacts. And I've got some visual aids for you. So, these are pieces of ceramic pottery. Notice the decoration on the outside, right? Different groups tend to make pottery in different ways. So, when we see a style from another area occur in this one, we can assume that something has changed. So, but that is an assumption, right? Because there's other cultural processes that could be happening. Local inhabitants might be making their own renditions of a style that they encountered somewhere else. We also have the actual physical movement of these materials, right? So this could be traded or it could be brought with people as they move into the area. But these pottery styles can last for decades or centuries. So that also complicates the picture. It makes it difficult when we see a new type of pottery arrive in an area. It makes it difficult to say for certain if this is a wave of migration, if this is local reproduction, if this is trade. And we do have ways of answering those questions. We do all sorts of material analysis on these, but we can't just look at the surface of the pottery and be absolutely certain right from the get-go. Right? This takes a level of scientific analysis. And even then, it's difficult to pin those dates down again, right? Like I said, those pottery styles can last for a broad period. And if we don't have any kind of residue buildup on the inside, like this one doesn't have any, then we don't really have anything to date on that to pin it down exactly when it arrived there. And then finally, what are the impacts of this research? Of course, academically, we're interested in the broad picture questions, but there are real social implications, specifically for indigenous peoples, either in validating their oral traditions. Many groups might be interested in that material evidence to validate their stories, but also we need to be cautious because the archaeological study of human migration has also been used to deny land claims, particularly on ancestral grounds. So we need to be conscious of the implications of our research and to be judicious in what we say and how firmly we say it, especially when it comes to the movement of people. So we'll be covering just a few stories here, and because we're covering really 5 stories in 45 minutes or less, this is going to be kind of a whirlwind tour. I know I overuse that phrase. So I won't be jumping too much into the details, but like always, feel free if you have questions about any of these stories that we cover. As you come up with the question, post it in the chat, and we'll save some time at the end for some of these questions. So, of course, we'll be talking about the first English colonies and the Mayflower and the myths around it. After all, this month's chat is inspired by Thanksgiving, which is coming up. And so I do want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. Probably be wishing you that again at the end of the video, too. So we'll talk about the first English colonies in the Americas, and then we'll ask a question about who were the first Europeans in the Americas. Of course, probably you all know by now Columbus was not the first European to arrive. Not to say that the impacts of Columbus's voyages were not historically significant, because they have massive historical implications and are part of the reason why I am physically here right now, right? And so yeah, a lot of historical processes got kicked off by Columbus, including European colonization, but we may have all heard by now that Leif Erikson in fact arrived back in the start of the 11th century. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And speaking of voyaging peoples, we'll go from the Vikings to the Polynesians. And we'll talk about Polynesian settlement of the Pacific, specifically asking the question, how was Hawaii settled, and what are the extents of Polynesia? Some of you may in fact be surprised. And then we'll bring it back home and talk about settling the Southwest. We'll talk about Tessie's story, Tessie Naranjo's story of the Tewa migration. We'll talk about Alfonso Ortiz's account of the Tewa migration and how new communities form as a result of migrations. And then we'll rewind the clock and try to get at one of the bigger questions, which is the peopling of the Americas. This one has always been a contentious topic and should be a fun one to talk about. Hopefully I don't get anyone too upset. There are several theories. Some have since fallen out of favor and others have come into favor. This is one of those stories that far from being settled. And it's different from the other ones because we don't really have a lot of oral traditions about the arrival of people in the Americas, at least none that are clearly unequivocally about that event. Instead, what we have are archaeological theories, and over time, as new evidence has come to light, we have had to adjust our archaeological theories in order to better try to answer this question. So we'll start off with Plymouth and with the Mayflower. And of course, that story of the first Thanksgiving and how the colonists might have even starved if it weren't for the altruism of the Native Americans living in the area, sharing their food, and thus we have this harvest feast that we celebrate every year. Of course, that part of the story is more myth, but yeah, the Mayflower did land in Plymouth in December of 1620 and established a colony that, despite the challenges of winters in New England, despite the challenges of a spotty supply line, the colony actually survived. So, yeah, Plymouth is important to the sort of mythical origins of the United States and what makes the United States what it is today. After all, it's a story of people seeking religious freedom, of settling a new land and working hard, working really hard for their survival. And it's even a story of the sort of it's a story of multi-ethnic cooperation. And these are all parts of the American myth that we're sold. And that would be great to strive for. As current events have shown, we're kind of falling short and have always fallen short of, the ideal that the story represents. And yet, it is very much a part of the ideology of the establishment of the U.S. and a driving force in continually remaking American identity, hopefully striving more towards this ideal, right? Even if the actual story of the Thanksgiving feast was more fantasy than fiction. Okay, so why else is Plymouth important? Was it the first colony? Was it the first successful colony? Well, no. The first successful colony, as far as I can tell, was Jamestown, Virginia, which was established some 13 years earlier as a fort, but only a couple years prior did it actually become self-sufficient. So was Jamestown the first colony? Well, no. Roanoke was certainly before Jamestown. And you may recognize Roanoke because it's an enduring mystery, and was also the feature of an entire season of American Horror Story. So what makes Roanoke so special? Well, a part of what makes it special is that it was a failed colony. There were two attempts to establish Roanoke, one in 1585, and then one again later in 1587, and it was finally abandoned, or they finally gave up on trying to establish it or reestablish it by 1690. And the interesting part about Roanoke is that the first attempt, 1685, those settlers abandoned the settlement and actually hopped on board with Sir Francis Drake and kind of fled back to England. And then we have another wave that came in. Part of the motivation was trying to meet a deadline to establish a colony for a land claim by Sir Walter Raleigh, hence Raleigh, North Carolina. And so, yeah, they were like, let's do it again. And so they came back in 1687. There were a couple of supply runs that were supposed to resupply the colonists while they still established themselves that ended up running into trouble. So finally a supply line does get through in 1590, by which point nobody's there. And famously, all that they can find is that on a wooden post there's carved the word Croatoan. Croatoan possibly being a place or one of the area tribes. And so there are theories, there are mysteries about what happened to the colonists at Roanoke. One of the theories is that they obviously tensions had been strained prior to that last delayed supply run. Tensions had been strained between them and local Native American groups, and so possibly those tensions flared up and there was some conflict. Maybe everyone was just... But that doesn't explain the carving of the word, right? So, yeah, Croatoan. Does that mean that they went to Croatoan? And so one of the theories that's out there is that the Roanoke colonists actually ended up abandoning their colony and moving in with some of the local Native Americans. And in fact, in decades following, there would be stories about fair-haired, blue-eyed people living among the indigenous folks of the area. To date, however, I'm not aware of any DNA studies to test whether this is true or not. Another theory is that Spanish ships in the area, finally getting tired of some of these English privateers, essentially sanctioned pirates raiding their boats, came in, thought that Roanoke was some kind of pirate bay, if you will, and raided it. But there doesn't really seem to be any evidence. There's not really evidence of cannonballs, of European on European conflict. So the mystery still abounds. And what this says about European settlement of the Americas is that it wasn't simply something that got sparked and continued unabated. We had, especially early on, these failed colonies. And why especially early on? Because supply lines are tenuous based on these very not maneuverable ships coming months or even years apart to resupply the colonies. And folks trying to essentially build out of nothing and trying to farm land that's a different environment than they're used to farming, with plants that are probably not adapted to the area, and try to negotiate and trade with indigenous inhabitants who are, one, skeptical of the arrival of these new settlers, and rightly so, because the new settlers were probably probably had some very negative views of these indigenous inhabitants, viewing them as barbarous at best, which certainly is not a way to begin a negotiation. So Roanoke really represents this failed attempt, and thus how settlement of colonies in a new place kind of it's not a continuous process. It can have a lot of back steps and a lot of backtracking, especially at first, before more secure supply lines are established and before people really can adapt to this new place. If we were to sail a little bit far north, in fact, a bit far off of the English maps, because interestingly, places like Greenland and Iceland were not included on some of the early maps by the captains involved in the establishment and resupply of the colonies at Roanoke and Jamestown. But of course they were known. They were known by Europeans for, well, about 580 years at least. Leif Erikson in, I believe it was 1006, give or take, AD, followed the navigation of a earlier Viking merchant who in the mid to late 900s had sailed from Greenland to what we now believe to be Baffin Island, Nova Scotia, and eventually Newfoundland. Now, this earlier merchant supposedly never landed on shore, but reported all of these experiences. And so Leif Erikson followed the navigational directions and famously made contact with indigenous folks who you might know as Inuit. Archaeologically speaking, we tend to distinguish between a couple of ancestral Inuit cultures, one being Dorset and another being Thule. And of course, Leif Erikson abandoned his attempted colony in what we believe to be Newfoundland because of conflict with indigenous folks, with these ancestral Inuit, probably Thule or possibly Dorset. Now, this wasn't the last time that the Vikings would be in contact with Dorset. In fact, it probably wasn't the first time either. As you can see from this map up in the corner, sort of these crosshatched areas are the maximum extent of Thule settlement, ranging from pretty much upper British Columbia, almost Alaska, through the Canadian archipelago, and along Greenland, both shores. So, of course, the Vikings were, at least on this side of Greenland, at least as early as the 900s. So, they probably did encounter each other, with the Vikings calling the ancestral Inuit Skrælings, or Skrælings. And I would have to find my notes on what the Inuit word was for the Vikings, but of course they too had their own nickname. So these folks probably did interact before Leif Erikson arrived, and they certainly did for hundreds of years afterwards. One indication of which is this carved wooden figurine. Now, this is definitely a Thule figurine made by a Thule person, but it definitely does not represent a Thule person. The robes and attire seem to indicate a European, presumably a Norseman. There's been a lot of speculation over whether this design in the center of the chest is a cross, and if so, is this a clergyman, which would probably place them in the 13th, possibly 14th century? Or is it simply an indication that this person was Christianized, which places them certainly in the 11th century or after? There's also even been speculation that this depicts a knight from the Crusades, which theory is a little more tenuous. Really, really kind of a reach on that one. But nonetheless, this certainly is an indication of contact between Thule and Vikings, and in fact, there was trade. So while the Vikings noted that the quote-unquote Skraelings did not possess metallurgy of their own, we actually find some iron artifacts in association with Thule habitations. And so we believe that some of this is the acquisition of iron from Vikings, and then it is later modified into other tools, implements, projectile points. But there also may be some cold hammering of naturally occurring iron, such as in meteorites, which, especially once the material becomes known as something malleable, that malleable being used loosely here, it's certainly not a stretch that they might start modifying naturally found iron on their own too. There's other trade goods that happen as well, and in fact, Inuit peoples, at least as late as the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, still had oral traditions associated with the arrival of Norsemen, and specifically around some of the conflicts between ancestral Inuit and Norsemen. So once again, we see some of what we talked about in Roanoke happening here too, right? That we have the establishment of a colony that is later abandoned, and that but interestingly, there's also some level of cooperation too, right? That we have clear archaeological evidence of trade, much in the way that we have oral traditions of trade and cooperation between the earliest English settlers, say at least the early English settlers at Plymouth Rock, and Native Americans. We also have archaeological evidence of some level of trade going on here in the Arctic too. But again, the colonization kind of retreated, and yet we also have this kind of overlap, right? We have this overlap in Greenland that nonetheless folks weren't really bumping into each other a whole lot. It actually took several decades of archaeological work and conversation to really establish that, yeah, they're both kind of there at the same time, but using the land in different ways, and not even necessarily running into each other, or possibly even at times actively avoiding each other, even if they're inhabiting much of the same area. Sailing down to warmer waters now. We have Polynesians and the arrival of Polynesians in Hawaii. You'll see this picture in the upper corner. This is reproduced from Bingham. I don't know if you can read the text or not, because I have to stream in low quality here, but this is in a text by Cordy, 2002, reproducing a 19th century illustration of Waianae, which is the leeward side of the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian archipelago. And what you'll notice here is a grove of trees and this construction here. This construction is called a heiau, and this would be a bay. We believe it to be Pokai Bay, with this grove of coconut trees in the background. And what is significant about the coconut trees in Pokai Bay is that those trees were planted probably as much as 900 to 1,000 years before this rendering. Of course, these would be descendants of the original trees. The original coconut trees probably fell long before, but this is where we can turn back to oral traditions. And the Hawaiians tell of a story of a voyaging chief Pukai from Kahiki, which is sometimes you get the switching of the T and K vowels. So Kahiki literally translates to Tahiti, but in Hawaiian kind of can be used to generally mean another Polynesian island, a foreign land, probably a Polynesian land. And so in this story, Pukai sails from Kahiki and arrives at Oahu and plants this grove of coconut trees before heading back south to what is now French Polynesia. So this shows that settlement isn't just sort of arrive and set up camp. That there's actually this sort of these adjustments that are made to the landscape to make them to make it more viable. After all, coconut is not just a source of food and liquids and electrolytes, but it's a source of fibers. And coconuts are they are incredibly useful. In fact, the ropes, all the rigging on the boat that Pukai was sailing on was probably made from coconut fibers. And so by planting these trees, that ensures that if another boat arrives a few years later, that there will be resources for them to use in order to repair the craft and make it back in case there's been any damage at sea. And if there's not been, then of course there's plenty of uses for these things. So it helps establish and make this land habitable. Now, Pukai might not even be the first person to arrive in the Hawaiian Islands. Some of the Hawaiian oral traditions talk about menehune, or little people, who were sort of these mythical inhabitants of the islands that retreated to the hills when they were settled by the Polynesians we know today. Well, they might indicate an earlier arrival, and so you have people arriving later and you have people arriving earlier. The sailors from Tahiti may or may not have been the first ones to arrive in Hawaii. In fact, we believe that Hawaiian settlement largely kicked off from the Marquesas, which is another island archipelago in the South Pacific. So, but these are all within the Polynesian sort of world sphere. So you would have had Polynesians arriving from different places who had probably traveled to a bunch of different places too, but arriving from the Marquesas and from Tahiti, and possibly even from the Solomon Islands. But we're fairly confident about the Marquesas and from Tahiti. Because they're arriving at different times, you might have different colonies that are established, and then as later arrivals arrive, they have to kind of sort out, do we cooperate, do we trade, or do we call them menehune and chase them into the hills. There's also a story about the north shore of just checking the time. There's also a story about the north shore of Kauai, and that might have been a haven for ne'er-do-wells who had arrived from other parts of Polynesia, and you probably wouldn't have wanted to go to a dinner party with these guys, I'll say that much. And so they were certainly not a part of the same wave of folks who arrived. Now, why do I have this bar graph here? Well, these are radiocarbon dates. So you'll notice dates here, and you'll notice I was talking about that they're a range. So it could be, this date could be as old as, it's probably about 400 BC. It could be as late as
probably about 200, 250 AD, right? And the error bars are different depending on the sample. And what we see here is that there's at least 3 waves in the radiocarbon dates on Oahu, and, which are even more pronounced on the Big Island. And so you'll notice there's these sort of outliers. Those probably represent, we don't know if they're the earlier dates or the later dates. They could be as late as these later dates. And they might represent people arriving shortly after, well, in the first few centuries AD, but not really establishing permanent settlements. And then we have, these were surprisingly early as the about the 300s to about AD 600. There certainly seems to be a wave of people arriving in this time. And so that there may be an establishment of some colonies, and because there are more dates in this range, some of those colonies might have been successful. And then finally we have this last wave lasting from about AD 600 to about AD 1000, and that's when we'll really have a lot of people coming into the Hawaiian Islands, and we start to see the emergence of Hawaiian culture as we know it, beginning to distinguish itself from Polynesia more broadly. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I want to say that Hawaii was not the furthest extent of Polynesian sailing. That Polynesians, of course, arrived in Rapa Nui, which you may know is Easter Island, and they continued on from Rapa Nui into the New World, to South America. We still see signs of twin-hulled boats without the crab claw-shaped sailing rigs, but we still see these twin-hulled boats made out of reeds in Lake Titicaca. So this is probably a lasting cultural tradition from that Polynesian contact. And there's evidence that Polynesians also briefly arrived in the Channel Coast of California, so the Channel Islands and Santa Barbara. So Polynesians expanded quite greatly, although we don't typically think of them as settling South America, and they certainly didn't have any lasting colonies in California. So again, this picture is kind of complicated. So the a cat sitting back there, don't mind him. Settling the Southwest. So we talked about Tessie Naranjo's story about folks in Santa Clara, which is right at, so Okeowinge is right at the confluence of the Chama River and the northern Rio Grande. And right next to it, right down here, is Santa Clara. Now, Tessie talked about folks moving up from Santa Fe, but what we see in this diagram is more the story that we hear from folks like Alfonso Ortiz, who, not only a renowned anthropologist, was also Tewa from Okeowinge. And so when Alfonso Ortiz reports the story, it's because this is an oral tradition that's been passed down, that people moved, the ancestors of the Tewa moved south, and they encountered sort of marshy ground, and so the winter people went first because they could freeze the ground before them and make it hard enough to walk on, and then they were followed by the summer people sometime later on. Well, this is generally thought to map on with the abandonment of Pueblo III settlements in the Mesa Verde area. I think my cat wants attention and some camera time. Say hi, Haku. Hi. Hi. Yeah, there we go. So there is the overall, well, depopulation of this area, and depopulation of Mesa Verde, depopulation of Canyon of the Ancients, of Crow Canyon, and there was a movement of people into the Espanola Valley and into this area between Espanola and Santa Fe that is now that are now known as the northern Tewa Pueblos. But Tessie's story also talks about Tewa Pueblos, and so we probably had detachments of people who went to Picaris and to Taos. And Picaris and Taos themselves were actually settled centuries before this Tewa migration in the 1300s. These communities seem to have been established more or less around the turn of the millennium. And so that raises another question. Well, what happened? How did they get there? They may represent a wave of migration of folks leaving Chaco Canyon, which is around here. When Chaco collapses, there was probably a wave of people out of Chaco, much in the way that you see people coming out of the Mesa Verde area. There was probably a wave of folks coming out of Chaco, including a wave going up to Mesa Verde. And that somewhere around that time, you probably have people arriving in Taos and Picaris and establishing communities there. But of course, Chaco lasted into the 13th century, and these communities were already established at that point. So this kind of complicates the picture a bit more. The point being is that you probably have successive waves. You have the Towa arriving over here. You've got the Galisteo Basin. You've got Towa around here, and then you've probably got another wave who kind of begin to form new communities with the hunter-gatherers in the area and establish Picaris and Taos and at least one other pueblo. And that, of course, happened centuries before this wave of Tewa out from Mesa Verde, establishing the Tewa pueblos. And yet, some of them continued on and joined the Tewa communities as well. But at the same time that you have this movement that Alfonso Ortiz relates of folks out of Mesa Verde into, say, the Espanola Valley, as Tessie and Arano shows, you've got folks moving from Santa Fe, from Pecos, up into the Espanola Valley too. So the Tewa migration is actually a bunch of different migrations of different families coming together to establish these new communities. And now for the big topic, the peopling of the Americas. And that's just checking my time. Want to leave time for questions. Looks like we're doing pretty good. This is kind of a contentious topic because we don't have these oral traditions to relate to, and people actually tend to get really emotionally attached to their theories. The first theory was that Native Americans had only been in, if you were to discount their own oral traditions, archaeologists for a while thought that Native Americans had only been in the Americas for about 4,000 or 5,000 years. This was until a find of what we now, of a projectile point from what we now call the fluted point tradition here in New Mexico, in Folsom, New Mexico, at the Folsom site. And so New Mexico actually changed the picture of how we saw the peopling of the Americas, because for the first time we had these fluted points, and they were directly associated with extinct Ice Age megafauna. And wow, man, that just overnight changed everything. And so we have, there are a couple of different types of fluted points, but the two main types that we talk about are the Folsom points, named for the Folsom site in New Mexico, and the Clovis points, which are very similar. Clovis on average is a little bit bigger. So these are large spear tips, and yeah, they would have it would have been fairly brutal weapons, and very necessary for taking down these large animals. And so Clovis goes to about 12,000, maybe as far back as 13,000 years ago, and that's suddenly a lot longer, right? That's roughly 2.5 times even more than than we had thought people had been here. So for a long time, from that point, a long time, I mean decades, archaeologists thought that Clovis first represented this migration of people across the land bridge, closing the gap of the Bering Sea right here, right? And we just had to find the route. And so they started looking for this ice-free corridor, which there were two major ice sheets, one here and one here. And these kind of closed off, and they were closed off certainly, they were closed off until about at least 15,000 years ago, and probably until about 13,000 years ago. So it was, man, it doesn't give people much time to get down. And we definitely have evidence that once this ice-free corridor between these two ice sheets opened up, people started moving down it pretty quickly. But man, it didn't give them much time. And then as we look at the international distribution of Clovis points, they're actually more southern U.S. and much of what's now Mexico. And so that doesn't really look like a migration from the north either. That looks like people are already here. So, and then we start to get dates from places like Monteverde in South America, Meadowcroft in western Pennsylvania, and Paisley Cave in central Oregon. And these are all in the 14 to 15,000 year ago bracket, at which point that ice sheet is probably closed off. There's probably no ice-free corridor. So how are people getting to like the Great Basin and Paisley Cave? That's like quite a bit far even inland. But we know for sure because of a 14.5 thousand year old poop. There's a coprolite that contains DNA tied to modern Native Americans. So we know it's human. We know that it's an ancestor of modern Native Americans. And we know for sure from the carbon dating of this coprolite that it's 14,500 years old. So can't be the ice-free corridor. What else have we got? Now, prior to Paisley Cave, we did have these 14 to 15,000 year old dates, say at Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, but these were controversial because, say, Meadowcroft is near a coal vein, and so there was thought that some of the old carbon from that coal vein contaminated the samples from Meadowcroft. But Paisley Cave is not near a coal vein. There's no arguing contamination. That is an old poop. So we have to look for a different route. Well, we're to look at this map. We'll notice that during the last glacial maximum, from about 25,000 to 10,000 years ago, the seas were much lower. So much of what you see in white was probably land, right? So you had tons of low-lying land connecting Siberia to Alaska, Canada, and the U.S. So there was more than just a narrow bridge. There was essentially a whole other landmass, much in the way that like Asia Minor is, or the Arabian Peninsula is kind of its own landmass. It's not really a part of Africa, and it's not really a part of Asia. It's really kind of its own landmass connecting these other areas. And that's kind of how we have to see this area too. So instead of calling it a land bridge, we call it Beringia. And the new theory is, since we've got ancestors of people who would later become the Ainu in the Japanese islands, and ancestors of the Aboriginals in Australia, having some kind of seafaring technology as far back as to get to Australia 50 to 60,000 years ago. Certainly ancestors of the Ainu, getting to the Japanese archipelago no later than 20,000 years ago. And there's a theory that we had folks coming from, we know from the DNA, we've got folks coming from Siberia, but maybe they're hopping the shorelines in boats and following a coastal route down into the Americas. And then this would actually explain things a lot. Doesn't really, I mean, it could explain Paisley Cave, even though that's quite a bit inland. But maybe they got to Oregon and then just decided, well, let's head east now. There's game over there, boat's broken, let's go. And it certainly explains places like Monteverde in South America, which is more closer to the coast. This theory has yet to be unequivocally proven, but it does seem to indicate that there was an early wave of migration that makes it along the coastlines, spreads down the coast of North, Central, and South Americas very quickly, establishing small groups that would be ancestral to peoples who would live in all of these places in later millennia. Now, there are still some outliers. For a long time, there have been claims about a site in South America dating to 30,000 years ago, although this is very tenuous, based on some stones that may or may not be natural, or it may have a line to be used as essentially a bola, the two rocks on the end of a string used for tying up. If you think about the AT-ATs in Star Wars getting their legs tied up and falling, it's essentially what this type of technology would do. But we don't really see a lot of that in the Americas, and we don't see any flake stone associated with that site. So that one's probably a no, but there are some people who think it's a yes. And then we have this other site, another controversy that's come to light lately in the Savannah River Valley, where there are claims of an occupation below a Clovis occupation with carbon dates dating to 30,000 to 50,000 years ago. And this, too, is kind of tenuous because we don't have a lot of other artifacts associated with that. It really does seem to be some charcoal, but it's hard to explain charcoal in a cave. Is that charcoal contaminated? You know, like some of the arguments about Meadowcroft. And one of the reasons why I put this last is because if you did have, this is hypothetically, if you did have seafaring technology as far back as 30,000 years ago, it's not impossible that small groups of coastal hunter-gatherers could make it along a coastline. But how do they get to a place like the Savannah River Valley that's just crossed a continent? But if we were to discount that, outside chance that they, we could see something like a failed colony, right? An earlier attempt to colonize the area that failed, and, kind of like Roanoke, kind of like Leif Erikson's colony. Again, Savannah River Valley, very controversial. I would certainly not place any money on that stuff being that old. But it's not the first time that dates this old have come up, and so we do need to consider it, and we need to at least consider, if so, then how. And that's really sort of what it comes down to. So I'm going to come over to my references section here and get off the screen. As always, plenty more reading available. This was, there were a few sources that I used to make today's talk. So check any of these out. Of Of course, they're listed in the description below as well, if you would like to learn more about this. I especially recommend Stefan Milo's channel. He has these fairly well put together archaeological videos. His backgrounds and filming locations kind of put me to shame, so I need to kind of up my game. So yeah, that's but yeah, check those references out. So yeah, and hello everyone who was in the chat. Are there any questions? Or if there's no questions, we're kind of at our hour mark. So and if nobody's got any questions, I'll tune out. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed today's chat. Glad to have you all aboard. Yeah, and we'll have more lectures into the spring. Next month's lecture, since it's December and it will be the start of winter, will be very. I think next month will be more or less a week before the winter solstice, so our chat will be about the coldest time of them all, the Pleistocene. So we'll pick up pretty much where we left off with today's chat. So thank you all for tuning in. Stay healthy out there, and hope to hear from you all in the chat, and see you tune in next week.